Hey, this is Dan Patterson here from Questioning Christianity. It's fantastic to have you here on the channel. If you're brand new to Questioning Christianity, we are all about helping to connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And in this longer form conversation series, the goal is really to invite someone onto the channel who really knows what they're talking about, to unpack some of the myriad questions that either get sent into us through social media channels or through our website. If you haven't checked us out before, then please do check out this link. It's linktree/questioning Christianity. So linktr.ee/questioning Christianity. And you can find all the links there to our video content, to our blogs, really trying to help unpack Christianity for those of us who have questions and doubts and really want to know whether the Christian story is worth believing, whether Jesus is good news. And today we've got a really special episode. I feel like I say that nearly every time of our conversation series because I get to introduce you to the newest member of the Questioning Christianity team. It's myself, obviously Dan, we have James looking after our digital stuff, but we are now welcoming David all the way from Newcastle onto the speaking team, who's going to be so helpful in developing new content and going and doing talks in schools and universities and churches, really helping people wrestle with their big questions. So I'd love to be able to introduce you for the very first time to David Dean. Welcome, David. How you doing?
Hey, Dan, I'm well. How are you?
Very, very good. It's great to have you on from your home base down there in Newcastle. For those who may be joining us from outside of Australia, where is Newcastle?
Well, it is in Australia. Yeah, you're right, because there is the Newcastle in the UK. um,
You
but
do not sound
Newcastle,
British.
yeah, no, I've got too much of that Aussie drawl. Newcastle is east coast of Australia. It is 2 hours north of Sydney. So,
Yeah, really beautiful spot. Really beautiful
yeah,
spot. I've had the joy of getting to hang out with David and his wife Julie before in their place at Newcastle. So, look, if you're visiting Australia from across the shores, now that our borders are open again, I'm sure they'd love to see you. But
awesome.
David, since this is the first time that sort of our audiences got to say hello, do you want to fill us in a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in rural New South Wales, so I'm a country kid by heart. But then going off to boarding school, Newcastle was in the city. Newcastle was the happy medium for me, so I settled here for university, where I studied engineering and lived on campus for 4 long years. And it was during that time I met my now wife, and we've been married since 2014. So we've had one child, so little 2-year-old running around at the moment. And any day now, Dan, if I have to leave this interview, it's because baby number 2 has knocking on the door to come out. So yeah,
Super excited. We
um,
thought we'd just squeeze in this interview literally before, in the next hours or days, you're going to be heading to the hospital to welcome baby number 2. So huge congratulations to you and Julie. Can you fill us in a little bit maybe just about your faith journey then? So it's a little bit about life
sure.
and how did you come to know
I
Jesus?
yeah, I have a really interesting history of Christianity on both sides of my parents. Just to give one example, my mother was a missionary child in India, and there's a long history of her family in that country as well. She was a missionary from America, and she ended up meeting my father in Thailand. Both of them were working for World Vision, and then they moved to Australia, into this small rural town in northwest New South Wales. And Mum didn't leave until a bit over about a decade ago now, when they moved to the coast, when Dad semi-retired. So that would be my I guess parental background. But I didn't really take my faith seriously until just the end of my second year at university, and I guess going through a bit of a tough time at boarding school. I came out of that experience not wanting to put up with kind of, being told what to do again or bullying again. And so coming into uni, I was trying to be the cool cat and doing whatever I wanted to. And by the end of the second year, it was just a bit empty and hollow. And it was ironically going to be a good Christian example youth leader for some of the younger people back in the town that I grew up in, on a Katoomba convention camp, that I got up one morning early on and went to spend some time in the Bible. And it was reading there in Ephesians chapter 5 what it is to be a child of the light. And it occurred to me in that moment, wow, this is just not me. I'm a Christian around my Christian friends and non-Christian around my non-Christian friends. This inconsistency is a problem to me. And I put that as my, I guess, line in the sand for taking my faith seriously, because, the skies didn't rip open. I didn't hear an audible voice or anything like that, but I had a sensitivity to sin from that day on that I never had before. And so I came back to university, went into my third year a different person, and I didn't care about the perception of being a Christian on campus, and I became emboldened in that. That invited a lot of questions. And so I found myself doing apologetics before I knew what the word was. And yeah, over time that led to more opportunities, speaking, Bible study, leading. Ended up doing some further postgrad study related to theology and doctrine. And this is all on the side, by the way, of me doing full-time engineering work. I work in the defense and aerospace industry, have for over a decade now. And doing all of this other stuff on the side, it just got more and more and more traction. And here I am today. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. So basically, what you're saying is, I need to make sure that I don't upset you. Otherwise, some ordnance from above can destroy my current location. We won't spill too many secrets about your sort of job there. But interesting, kind of to explore. You know, we're at Questioning Christianity, really trying to take people's questions seriously. And there are some people who are Christians, other people who are maybe newcomers to Christianity and have curious questions, other people who have maybe had some really negative experiences of Christianity and so have some big walls or barriers or objections to being able to see this as good and true news. I'm curious as to whether or not any of these objections or doubts or barriers are things that you had to wrestle with either before becoming a Christian or sort of since.
Yeah, so I think coming out of the boarding school and then into the uni, the biggest unreflected point of objection that I had was I just don't want to be told what to do. And so it was the classic kind of young uni student mentality of I'll just want to do what I want to do, and I don't want to have borders and boundaries put around me. And then when the suggestion came about, I guess, lifestyle decisions and things like that, my thought was just why? Like, why would I want to subject myself to that? That was the initial kind of approach. And then as I started to take my faith seriously, realizing how hollow that was, you don't actually flourish without borders and boundaries. An analogy would be, I happen to be musical. I was trained on the piano at a young age, and you may be free from running around and doing what you want when you're having to practice the piano, but having gone through that discipline, I'm now free for playing the piano. And so that freedom from, freedom for, that's something that I came to appreciate the hard way through my early years of university. But I guess now it's really been questions around suffering and personal loss and pain are just so thorny. And I mean this in the sense of a lot of the pastoral work that I've done. I've had some grief in my own life, but I've got friends who've had horrific grief, and there's nothing you can say you just want to be with them. But as I process that myself, which I think is the thorniest of all issues, just deep grief, deep loss, like particularly as a dad, like when children are involved, this stuff is really, really confronting. And I think thinking through that myself, even though it's gut-wrenching, some of this stuff, I just have that thought of where else will I go? Like, who alone has the words of eternal life? I mean, you may be tempted to walk away when it gets difficult, but at the end of the day, like, Christianity has a God crucified on a cross. I mean, it doesn't shirk from the question of evil, pain, and suffering. In fact, it has that as its center point. So maybe it has something to say about it, even if I'm hurting right now. So I have wrestled through that. I still wrestle through it. I think we all do in various ways. But for me, that one has slowed me down the most. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and certainly resonate with it sort of on a personal level too. I'm sure many of the sort of audience watching do as well. Well, let's dive. So we're going to do a bit of a hot seat experience where people that send in questions to our website or through social media all gets emailed to us, and then we just collate them and then do these rapid fire kind of sessions. So I'm going to throw a bunch of questions your way, Dave, and we'll see how many we can get through kind of in this conversation. We may need to save some for the next one. But the first cab off the rank was just kind of the question: how do I know God is real? How do I know God is real?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'd want to kick off by saying, taken in itself, Christianity is not really a philosophy. It's not really an ethic. It's certainly not an empirically verifiable science. You can't put God into a test tube. But taken by itself, Christianity is a revelation. and what we do with that revelation, with our sciences and our ethics and our philosophizing, and that's all important. But before it's put through those paces, Christianity is a revelation concerning human salvation through Jesus Christ, the promised Jewish Messiah. So I guess the question really comes out as, how can I know God is real? Well, by what God chooses to reveal to us. So when it comes to God's revelation, we know that's spoken of in a couple of different ways. You've got the general revelation in nature itself. If God exists, just for argument's sake, then he is the creator according to the Christian tradition. And so he has created all things. So just like we can know something of Elon Musk through a Tesla car, we can know something of the creator through his creation, whether that's the heavens, the earth, the skies, the trees, whatever it is, or even human nature, the ethics that we have, the moral kind of codes that we have across cultures, things like that. So these all speak to something about God, and we can know something transcendent through that. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we do have a sense of the transcendent in those moments of quiet, whether that's out in nature or reflecting, even as I was just before, on some of those huge existential questions about the meaning and purpose of life in the face of suffering. And this is the sense of wrongness. There's something that is transcendent in that. But the other way that God is revealed to us is in a special form through his scriptures, and chiefly through the person of Jesus Christ. And I guess throughout history, Christian thinkers have developed different ways to argue for whether that's the general revelation through various arguments such as the cosmological argument and so on, or the moral argument, and also worked to defend the reliability of the scriptures and the historicity of the person and work of Jesus Christ. So these are ways that we know God and that we can verify whether or not what is supposedly known about him can be trusted and tested. But I guess at the end of the day, I just want to wrap all that up by saying that God is not just a theory to be studied in a book. We can know a lot about God, but knowing God personally is quite a different thing. I can know a lot about my wife, but that doesn't make her my wife. And that is where the element of faith comes in, not necessarily as a way of knowing. Like, you don't need to tack that on to your gap of knowledge. That's not what we're talking about here. It's fidelity, it's trust, it's relying and depending on who he is in a personal relationship. And so, the scriptures tell us to seek the Lord, and he's there. He will not turn away those who come after him. So how can we know God is real? By searching after him and asking him, and hearing what he has to say in response. Yeah.
Oh, mate, I love that, between the creation kind of side of things, of him making himself known in nature and through human nature, as well as then through what's made known in history. Really helpful. The next question that we had in was, why does God care about how I live my life? I've often seen this with figures like the late Christopher Hitchens. It's that God is, what business would this huge deity have caring what I do with my body, what I do with my mind, what I do with my hands? It just seems strange. Why does God care about what we do with our lives?
Yeah, this is a good question. And again, this kind of plays into a bit of my own testimony. I think the short answer is the reason God cares about how we live our lives is because God cares about us. Throughout the Bible, again, we see time and again God caring for his creation, whether that's the plants, the environment, and most of all, us unique of all creatures, namely human beings who are made in his image. So how we live matters. Because our decisions, our choices, these affect us deeply. It affects our lives. And I guess the evidence that God cares for how we live is given in the fact that he gave his life for us. It was our life choices that steered us away from him, and it was his choice with his life that brought us back. So why does God care about how I live my life? Because we matter to him. He loves us deeply. That's the famous, well-known verse, God so loved the world that he sent his one and only son. So yeah, that would be
I
a short
appreciate that
answer.
as a dad too. It's like, why do I care about what happens with my kids? Because I love them. I want things to go well for them, so I care what choices they make. Yeah. All right. Next question we had in was, why does the Bible have so many contradictions? If we're meant to believe or trust that this book is worth listening to, what's with all the contradictions in the Bible?
Yeah, it's just a little tricky to try and answer without having any specifics involved. I guess I'd want to slow down first of all and try and understand maybe an example of what these contradictions are, or what is
Well,
on the
well, let me
tip of
give you one that I get commonly, right? And so Bart Ehrman, a sort of famous New Testament thinker, critic, textual critic, he often takes the parallel gospel accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when it comes to something like the resurrection, the Christian case is built on Jesus coming back from the dead. But he'll say, read the 4 resurrection accounts. How many women went to the tomb? Was it 1? Was it 2? What were their names? Was it Mary, or was it Salome? And when they got to the tomb, was the stone there, or had it already been rolled away? And did they see 1 man or 2 men or 2 angels? So that sort of thing. If you read these accounts, and there seems to be contradictions in the resurrection accounts, what do we do with that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I remember one of my professors once quipping, "Where there's one, there's two." So the point with that would be, in terms of whether or not there's 1 woman or 2 or angels or whatever in the different narratives. It's not to say that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Now, that point, and this is to raise the point of harmonization between the gospel accounts. There's an excellent book by Mark Strauss called 4 Portraits, One Jesus, and he unpacks really nicely the different vantages and the perspectives and the purposes that are geared into the particular authors. For example, there's no mistaking that Matthew is writing for the Jewish audience, whereas Luke has more of a Gentile audience in mind. John coming as a non-synoptic gospel, not Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but John is uniquely interested in some of the theological dimensions. And so the intention of the author behind their respective accounts, I think, goes a long way to helping us realize the differences. But that said, I'm not interested in just trying to fit a square into a circle if it doesn't fit. I think we need to be honest and real that there at times are textual variants, and I don't want to necessarily say that is a mistake. It may be a historical mistake or a transcribing mistake. There may be answers to that that we could find in the literature or even in the footnotes to some of our Bibles. But I don't want to necessarily say that it's definitely a contradiction without having done some of the unpacking as to why perhaps there are different accounts in place. So, I mean, just to give one example that's clear, not to use a gospel, but in the Old Testament, for example, we have Daniel chapter 1 talks about the ascension of King Nebuchadnezzar I think it was the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. And then you go to, say, Jeremiah chapter 46, and it talks about that being in the 4th year. And so you're like, well, that's a clear numerical, quantifiable contradiction, right? But then you dig into some of the commentaries and you see that they're actually working on different calendar systems. And so there's different conventions. And analogously, this would be like in Australia, you walk in on the ground floor and you go up to the 1st floor, whereas in the States, you walk in on the 1st floor and go up to the 2nd floor. So they're geared differently. That may account for a perceived contradiction in that sense. And you may be able to do that with some of these gospel examples as well. Probably need to tease through them. But again, to say that, there was 1 woman in one account and 2 in another is not necessarily mutually exclusive any more than, Judas, who took his own life, hung himself or fell headlong. Well, they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive as well. They could be reconciled as well. Yeah.
And there's like an interesting angle to take on here, because the question of contradictions in the Bible, even if there were absolute contradictions, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something substantively true being communicated. So that the differences in the details, like various eyewitness testimony accounts, people remember things differently or they represent things differently. But if you had 4 different accounts, even if there are some small differences, but they get all the core facts right, it may actually increase your confidence that they haven't got together and with some kind of conspiracy theory hat on, colluded to be able to give you exact same storyline, but that the differences actually represent this is independent testimony, and so at least you can trust the bare bones, the core facts of the ideas as well. Interesting ways of responding to a question like that, but I really appreciate kind of the push for, well, let's get details on it, let's investigate it and see what we can make of this. So just appreciate that heartbeat. Next question we have, and it's kind of a difficult one to answer. What evidence is there for the Old Testament, specifically Exodus? So for those who are newcomers, the Bible's divided really into 2 parts. There's 39 books, which are referred to as the Old Testament, or everything that happened in God revealing himself in history up until the coming of Jesus. Then it's about 4 centuries BC. And then you've got the New Testament, which represents the life and teaching and then ongoing impact of the legacy of Jesus of Nazareth after his death and resurrection. And so the Old Testament kind of references, that period BC, before Christ. So what evidence is there to support that this is a reliable window into history or God's revelation of himself?
This is a great question. I took one class on this in the UK from Callum Miller. And so, sorry, Callum, I just cannot recall your lecture. What evidence is there for the Old Testament, specifically Exodus? So I guess I'm not sure. I need to do more work in this myself. Is just the upfront confession here. Maybe a few points to say. There are some good texts on this. K.A. Kitchen, Reliability of the Old Testament is one, and I'd encourage a deep dive into that for myself as well as the listeners. But there are other points as well to make. The Old Testament, it just does not have the kind of attestation like the New Testament does. And this is partly because of the nature of history. The further back you go, the harder it is to get points to verify certain accounts or claims. But what evidence is there for the Old Testament? At least two kinds. We do have some archaeological evidence that can be surveyed regarding ancient Egypt, for example, and the pharaohs. And so that's one angle that you could take. Another angle is the textual evidence itself of the scriptures. So the intra-text evidence and cross-comparing that with itself and with other texts of that era. And then to try and deduce the reliability, if there's internal coherence, etc. So that would be a good study to do that I need to get on and do myself. What about you, Dan? Do you have any background in this?
I think that's just helpful points. I mean, I remember listening to one ancient historian say the problem with piecing together history and then being able to verify each and individual source through other external sources is that we have less than 1% of the ancient world available to us, that the sands of time are brutal. And so surviving texts or pottery shards or any serious structural evidence of various peoples, we're piecing together real tidbits to try and create a more broad history. So I'm just not sure we're ever going to be able to have external verification for everything in the Bible. I think it's important too with parts of the Old Testament to recognize that they're different forms of literature. And so what they're trying to communicate as to whether it's historical chronicle or as to whether it's meaningful parable really depends on kind of what that would be too. But the Bible does seem to have a relatively good track record on this. You know, I've traveled through Israel, and there were, even up until 50 years ago, a whole range of Old Testament claims that were heavily disputed. Even the existence of King David as a historical figure, heavily disputed amongst critical scholars, until they uncover a palace or discover some coins or come across a new tablet that bit by bit seems to really validate much of Old Testament broad history. And so it's really worth digging into sort of bigger texts like the Kitchen tome that we spoke about before. With the Exodus specifically, I recommend a video by Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. He's done a deep dive into Exodus, just recently put out a brilliant long form kind of film, just working through some theories around sort of the timelines and possible candidates for which pharaoh it could have been and which people group it could have been. So that might be worth checking out over at Inspiring Philosophy's YouTube channel too. But let's jump on to another question. And actually, it's in the theme of Exodus, so it works. It says, when God hardened Pharaoh's heart, did that go against his free will? How do you bring together the sovereignty and free will question when it comes to seemingly God hardening people's heart, Romans 9 kind of stuff?
Yeah, 15 seconds. Let's go. Wow, big question. Yeah, all right. So Christians have different models to account for the age-old question of human freedom and God's divine sovereignty. And it's not just within Christianity that this has been worked through. And this goes right back to 3rd, 4th century BC with the Greeks, and you can see it even in the Homeric literature with the idea of fate and so on. It's a big question, and I guess from my end, if I could, maybe just park the different models and just kind of tease out a little bit about this question specifically. Exodus 1:18, where we find the account, it's an intense part of the biblical story, and it raises huge and heavy theological questions. It's this epic showdown between God and Egypt, the pharaohs, and over the fate of the Israelites who are subjugated under their rule there. And I think the first point to say is that there is this repeat appeal to Pharaoh by Moses to let my people go, let my people go. And the text doesn't just jump in and say God hardened his heart and he didn't let them go. It actually says across a number of different passages that Pharaoh hardened his heart. So there was this hardening going on with Pharaoh. And then towards the end of it, we see that these passages referring to God hardening Pharaoh's heart as well. And then when we bring that over to the New Testament, we see that coming from, like you said, in Romans, Paul's writing about that really from the perspective of God, where God does harden people's hearts. But that's not to exclude the hardening, the initial hardening that took place in the life of Pharaoh himself. And so I think that's an important point, that there are different contexts when Paul is writing in the New Testament. He's making one particular point about what we see there in that Exodus account. And yeah, I think maybe from 100,000 feet, the answer is God works with humanity, and humanity who is obstinate and hard, he will work with that. And if that means after a time perpetuating the place that humanity is already at, to bring about his purposes, then he's done that. That's what, you meant that for evil, God meant it for good, referring to the cross of Jesus Christ. God can work with broken humanity to bring about good purposes. And in the case of Pharaoh, that was working with his already hardened heart as well. I think maybe the principle or the doctrine underneath this is unpacked in Romans chapter 1 a little bit, as there is this explanation of the nature of sin, but then towards the end, I think it's 30 or 31, Romans 1, 30, 31, God gives them over, and they end up celebrating in that that hardness of heart, in that sin. But I think the point to make is that, God isn't causing the evil up front, right from Adam. Where are you, Adam, in the garden? He's searching out humanity. Right to the next chapter with Cain. Where is your brother? He's always appealing for humanity to respond and acknowledge their wrongdoing. But when that is consistently ignored, just like a callus, when I'm playing guitar, it gets harder over time, and God ends up working with that hardness of heart that is brought about by our own volition. And I think that's what we're talking about here with Pharaoh.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense, and I think particularly the real concern behind a question like this is God good in the way in which he works with humanity? Can I really trust him? Because if he's going to hold me accountable for my choices, am I really free to have made choices otherwise? Is this something that he forces me into, or do I have meaningful agency? And so I really appreciate just a way of being able to express how do you preserve that. This next question is big and may cover a lot of ground when it comes to just trying to work through misconceptions or people's hurts and experiences. But it says, why is God against our sexual freedom? This is one sent in through the website.
Yeah. I want to be sensitive, of course, in this as well, because I appreciate that there are very personal challenges around this and hurts. And so I don't want to be too kind of academic, but I guess on paper, it's important to say freedom as a concept, I think, is part of the puzzle here. It's present in so many disputes that we have. But freedom as a concept, it only really makes sense against some sort of background. We can't be free from something if there's nothing to be free from. So bringing that into this question, why is God against our sexual freedom? I guess that assumption is that God there is holding us from being free. He's like blocking out the sex or the sexual liberties in some sense. And I suppose the way that this question is written, why is God against our sexual freedom, has that as an assumption. And maybe I want to just question that assumption gently, because when we open up, again, the scriptures, sex is on the front page. Be fruitful and multiply is one of the first things that God says to humanity. He says to look after creation and then be fruitful and multiply on that creation. So sex is a part of God's creation. It's a part of his design. And it actually, the act of sex and the union that it brings about in a physical way and an emotional and a spiritual way, it actually points to what it is to be made in the image of God, a relationally harmonious God in himself. So God doesn't block out sex. He's the creator of it. But obviously that's not to say that he doesn't have something to say about it. And there are borders and boundaries circumscribed within Scripture about sex and practice, and even down to the thought life. And I guess God cares about that, again, because he cares about us, and sex affects us deeply. That's why, and sexual liberties, nobody works with unbridled sexual liberties. We all have borders and boundaries in place. I mean, that's what makes sexual abuse so horrific, because it's the transgressing of some of those borders and boundaries. And when it comes to where those borders and boundaries are and what's right and what's wrong, I guess my question is, who draws that? And this is why I think what God has to say about sex should be listened to, because he arguably from creation draws those borders and boundaries about sexual thoughts and practices in a way that dignifies human beings and allows us to flourish in the way that we've been designed and created. Maybe an analogy would be, fire in a fireplace can warm a whole house, but you let it out and it burns the place down. And I think that's so apt, because sex is like that. It can do so much damage. That's, again, why abuse is so horrific. But in the right context, it can really be an incredible warming thing for a relationship and a couple. So I don't think it's a hedging of, well, it is a hedging of liberties in the sense that everything's permissible, but not everything's beneficial. And so God cares about us, and he has, outlined some parameters for our sexual thoughts and practices in alignment with how we're made.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that's really, really helpful. And for those maybe digging into this question a little bit deeper, we did a long form interview in our conversation series with Sam Albury maybe 8 or 9 months ago. So if you want to check on the channel and go back and watch that, there's also a long one of our shorts videos, on why does God care about my sex life, which will unpack a fair bit in there. So feel free to jump onto those. And the next one's really heavy and something that in our cultural moment, certainly a lot of people maybe have misgivings about when it comes to Christianity and religion. They think that the church is for straight people, and that anyone who is from the LGBTQ community, that they're either not welcome in the church, and certainly not welcome when it comes to heaven. And so this question comes: do gay people go to heaven? And love for you to be able to sort of speak to, obviously the heart with which that's asked.
Yeah, that's the short answer, and it does not deserve a short answer, but not being gay doesn't send me to heaven, therefore being gay doesn't send me to hell, right? This isn't about sexual orientation at all in that sense. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son does not have life. It's 1 John 5:12. So being a Christian isn't about being a certain way with respect to one aspect of your life, namely sexuality. The whole point about being a Christian is this beautiful divine exchange of our old life for his new one, and the transformation that brings about. I suspect perhaps what's underneath this question, we've had a lot of press about this in Australia with certain celebrities and stuff over the years, would perhaps go to that 1 Corinthians 6, 9-10 passage that talks about who inherits the kingdom of God. But I think when we unpack that passage there, because homosexuality and fornicators, etc., there's a long list is mentioned there about not inheriting the kingdom of God. But
slanderers and like a broad range of different sin.
Yeah. And I think the point there is, again, if we don't just isolate that one aspect, is to say that unrepentant people who are unrepentant and stuck in their sin, who don't have that transformation, who have not accepted the Son, won't inherit his kingdom. And so I think that's the point of that passage. It's not to isolate anyone. It's just examples of what this looks like. And if we keep on reading there, even in that immediate context, Paul says, "Such were some of you, but you've been washed, you've been cleansed, you've been changed." So, not at all is the short answer. Christianity is not about being gay or not gay. It's about being in Christ. And I have many friends who are gay and who are Christians and love the Lord with all their heart. And, there are unique challenges with that, but there are also challenges with me not being gay and being a Christian, loving the Lord with all my heart every day. So this is just a part of what it means to live in a world that's broken, including our sexuality. And again, I mean that for gay people and non-gay people. There are challenges across the spectrum. So this is fundamentally a human, part of the human condition that Jesus Christ has come to redeem. And that's what I'd want to say first and foremost is all people are welcome. Whoever comes to the Lord, he will not cast out. Yeah.
I appreciate that, mate. Really appreciate that. Next question, and we're just firing heavy questions, and that's just because these are the ones that people are asking. But it says, why would God create people to send them to hell?
Dan, you're the hell guy. You know a bit more about this than me, right? Why would God create
I don't
people
know
to
if that's
send them?
something to boast about, right?
No,
All he
I
means
don't.
by that is I had to write my master's thesis on the doctrine of hell and spent a fair bit of time sort of processing different views on this.
Yeah. Look, hell
But I
is
think
not.
like the question here really comes down to the injustice question. You know, it's a little bit like before with God hardening people's heart. Is he creating some purely so that he's going to send them into judgment? What is his heart towards people who end up, you know, in hell? Is it because God doesn't love them, because he passes over them? What's the deal here?
Yeah. So I guess this comes down to why would God create people to send them to hell again? Just in the way that that's asked, there's a big assumption that he's out of the gate. God is directing people to hell, and I know within some Christian circles that's certainly the theological position that is held. So I don't want to suggest that this isn't a real question, even for some Christians to wrestle with, depending on how they view God and how they view humanity and our autonomy or lack thereof before Him. I personally don't believe God creates people and then sends them to hell. I think it's God has created human beings and He asks all of us to come to Him. I think you see a wonderful tension here in His creation and His organizing of our borders and our boundaries and our places of habitation and our dwelling. In Acts chapter 17, Paul unpacks this there at Mars Hill as he's talking to the different philosophers, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And, you know, there's this primary sense in which God puts us in a place, but then there's a secondary sense in which we are called to respond to that. We had to grope after Him because He's not far from any one of us. So I think there is within our, you know, unique places and times that we are a call on every single human being to repent and believe in Jesus Christ. So, and if that doesn't happen, then the question is, if they're not going to be with God in that relationship, then where will they be? And I would argue that separation from God is what we call hell. Now, what hell looks like and how it's defined and unpacked, I think that's really a question all of its own. But I guess for now, I'd want to say that God doesn't create people to send them to hell. God creates people to know and to love Him. And if they choose not to know and love Him, then non-relationship or separation from God is what scriptures have referred to as hell. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got another helpful short video, maybe just unpacking that a little bit further. It's does God send people to hell? And maybe just deal with some of the red flags that are just raised by that hell question. What is it, and how do we process it? Our emotional response, the justice of hell, and some of that. So that video might be helpful to you. But really useful response, mate. Thank you for that. Next question. What happens then? So we've just described that there is some reality that people who live and die without putting their hope and trust in Jesus, is there an eternal consequence for that? And this next question says, what happens to people who don't hear about the gospel? Which, if you're new to Christianity, the gospel is just shorthand for the good news about Jesus, His death and resurrection, that through which we can enter into new life with God. So, but what happens to people, like, think of the tribes people in the Amazon jungle before missionaries made it there. There's still that island today just off sort of the Indian coastline. There's just groups of people today that still haven't really heard about this opportunity for Jesus. What happened to people who die without Jesus?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a real question, and it's both those who haven't been able to hear for geographical reasons, as you mentioned, but also those who are too young to hear. Think of infants, or those who are impaired and they therefore can't process. So this cuts across a couple of different layers and levels. I think maybe some starting points towards an answer to this question, which is a really good one, is it goes back to what we considered in that first question. I think about how do we know God, the nature of revelation. So what we see in the first instance is that there is a sense in which I think everyone, particularly those people who are geographically distanced or whatever, have an inkling of something about God in virtue of what's been made around them and also in virtue of themselves. So there is some sort of revelation there. It does get trickier, though, with, again, those examples of people who aren't necessarily cognitively able to process that. And you do see perhaps an implication about this in Romans chapter 1, where he says that his eternal nature and his divine attributes have been are clearly perceived through what has been made. But what if that can't be clearly perceived for whatever reason? Well, it says they are therefore without excuse because it is clearly perceived. But perhaps if they can't be clearly perceived, they therefore have an excuse. Now, that's just an inference, but you do see it kind of unpacked, I think, at the end of John chapter 9, where there's that blind man who is healed, and the Pharisees are asking Jesus about it, like, what was wrong with him that he was born blind? And Jesus makes this comment, and he's clearly going from the physical of the miracle to the spiritual when he says, if he was if he remained blind, then he would be without sin, and he'd be without excuse. And so there's an aspect in which we are judged in proportion to our knowledge, is what I'm trying to say. And again, just to give another example, sorry, I'm shotgunning passages here, but we hear back in Genesis, we hear in the New Testament about Abraham back in Genesis. He believed, and it was reckoned to him. He had faith, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So, what did he have faith in? The quote-unquote gospel? Jesus, yes. No, I'd argue he had faith in proportion to the knowledge that he had at the time that was revealed to him. And so I think at the end of the day, I rest on, again, another Genesis passage, shall not the judge of all the earth do what's right? He is the sovereign judge. He is the right and good judge. And I believe that he, again, works with people where they are in their unique times and places and abilities. Yeah.
Super helpful. And for those who are watching and maybe never come across our social media platforms before, we, in addition to the short videos on our YouTube channel, like What Happens to People Who Die Without Jesus, also put out then this series of slides. So, and each one of these sort of visual representations spells out a different line of the argument. So many of the things that David just said, you're like, oh, gee, that was kind of helpful, but I want to dig in a little bit deeper. If you jump on the Question Christianity Facebook page, or if you jump onto at QC Socials in our Instagram, you can just go back, find that post, and then flick through those slides just to get some different content on what happens to people who die without Jesus. Mate, one last question before we start, a bit of a sign off. You've been so gracious sitting in the hot seat, getting thrown with a bunch of difficult questions. But just the people that are watching this who maybe are Christians or are exploring belief in God, but are still plagued by these doubts or the sorts of questions we've looked at where they come up in their own faith. I struggle to be able to trust in God. What do you do with doubts? What's a right response when you have these big questions come up?
It's a great segue to the name of Questioning Christianity. Question Christianity. And again, you see biblical precedent for this, the resurrection and doubting Thomas. He's in that room. The word comes back that Jesus has risen from the dead, and he says, I will not believe unless I can see for myself. And Jesus invites him. He says, come, put your hand in my place. There's that invitation. And again, at the end of John's Gospel, John 20, we read that these things have been written so that you may believe. So search it out. The whole point about a doubt is it's a question in our mind, and it's part of our nature as human beings. The very fact that we doubt, I think, says something about us, that little signal of transcendence. We're wanting to know the truth. And where does that propensity, that drive to know the truth come from? Why do doubts make us restless? Where does that come from? That is the question. So let's question our doubts. And I think there are answers to be found in pursuing the person and work of Jesus Christ. And the thing that I love about Christianity, and I mean this with all my heart, it does not, it challenges you to question it. In 1 John, in his letter there, we're encouraged to question things. So it's basically bring it on, question Christianity. Bring your doubts and see if your doubts have trunk enough to say that's just not for me, or whether or not Christianity can answer your doubts, because living with a doubt can be really crippling. It can be a horrible thing. And I do believe that, again, Jesus Christ has come that we may have life and have it to the full, and that our doubts can be answered in him. That's not to say we don't have questions, but I think it's how we deal with the doubts. I have doubts all the time as a Christian, by the way. It's just how we deal with those doubts in light of who Jesus is that gives us hope through them, so we don't get stuck in this quagmire of confusion. Yeah.
Super helpful. Super helpful. Well, mate, any last words for those that were listening and maybe wondering, and is this Christianity thing really worth believing? What would you say to that person?
Yeah. You know what? The longer I live, and I'm not that old, 34, but the longer I live, the more I just in like the self-authenticating nature of the Christian life and even the scriptures. Why do I believe the Bible? Because it is just demonstrated itself in my life to be true, and that might not satisfy other people. I don't particularly care anymore. I just really want to encourage people to check it out for themselves. I appreciate that there are, good arguments, objective arguments, ways of rigorous, formulation to prove a point. But I think at the end of the day, like I said earlier on, this is a relationship with God, and we do have these heart tug questions. And if you come to Jesus Christ, all your questions won't fall away, but life's greatest questions will find answers outside of yourself, and that is so important because to be defined by your circumstances, it can be really, crippling and damaging if your circumstances are tough. But to be found in Him, who is risen from the dead, means that you can weather any storm. And as Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, it's the secret of contentment no matter my situation. He wrote that in chains, without friends, without family, facing the chopping block, and he could still say that. My encouragement is just to give it a go, to seek Jesus Christ, and to see how does this really make sense of some of my questions.
So helpful. Well, mate, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to the team. It's been great to give you a bit of an introduction to our QC friends and audience online. So I'm sure they'll be seeing tons more of you over at your own channel. If they want to check out some of the stuff you've done in the past already, some Ask series, some radio stuff, you have a website. Can you tell us about that?
I do, drcdeane.com. Now, let me say this.
Is that Dr. Dean? Is that a doctor situation there?
My wife warned me of this. It's not. My two middle initials, Robert Charles, David Robert, DRC Dean. It's not. I'm not a doctor. I don't want to hold that title. So apologies for the bad domain name. But with that said, feel free to check that out. I've got I'm coming up to 50 episodes there. I have like a little Ask segment that gets aired on the radio as well. I have some various articles. I encourage you to write in and ask some questions and question Christianity. So
super helpful. Yeah, well, thanks so much, mate. We're looking forward to seeing tons more of your face on QC channels in the upcoming months and years. For now, go and have a baby, and richest blessings and prayer that goes safely for you and Julie. She's got the hard work to do. So just appreciate you, mate. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well, to everyone who joined in for this live stream, thanks so much. Really appreciate getting your questions through the social media and through the website. So please do keep sending them in. If you like this material, please do go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share it around to anyone you think will be helpful. We are all about connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So until we see you next time, truth invites questioning. See ya. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.